Thank you for choosing to listen to PhoenixFire today. PhoenixFire features John Anthony West. You can access the PhoenixFire blog at www.jawpenixfire.blogspot.com. You can learn more about John Anthony West by going to www.jawest.net. PhoenixFire.
This is PhoenixFire, John Anthony West, rogue Egyptologist and mystic in skeptics' clothing, broadcasting from West Henge in the wilderness with something to offend everyone. Welcome to the conflagration. Son of Mystery of the Sphinx, and the quest to rewrite history, further Sphinx evidence, and the Geo-panel. So, let us start with the historical overview. Pick up a book, any book, about ancient Egypt. High school, university, and look at the chronology. According to the standard story, Egypt begins as a recognizable civilization somewhere around 3500 BC. There are always tweaks and fiddles with this. As new evidence comes up, it becomes clear that perhaps it's older. But by and large, the Egypt that we know, dynastic Egypt, starts around 3500 BC. Now, the Egyptians themselves had a very different view of their history insofar as they told their history, and they didn't tell us much. Now, to backtrack just a bit, most of you tuned in probably know me through my work on ancient Egypt and my championing of the symbolist interpretation of Egypt developed by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. Well, the way that comes about is a long story in itself, which I will reserve when I do a different variant of autobiographical detail. But Schwaller, in his main book, The Temple of Man, where he develops the symbolist interpretation, he doesn't talk about chronology. But as I was doing my own book, Serpent in the Sky, an in-depth introduction to Schwaller's thinking and Schwaller's interpretation, in one of his ancillary works, a book called in French, Le Roi de la Théocratie Pharaonique, or The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy, now translated into English as Sacred Science. In this book, which adds a lot of information and data to his symbolist interpretation, there is a long chapter called The Chronology of Egypt, in which Schwaller takes note that the ancient Egyptians did not think their civilization began at 3500 BC. Of course, they're not using those dates, but they cite in several. One is a stela, a stone tablet called the Palermo stone, and in another very ruinous papyrus called a Turin papyrus, the Egyptians talk about long reigns prior to their own civilization, in which Egypt was ruled first by the Necheru, the gods themselves, for long thousands of years, and then another long period when Egypt is ruled by the Shemsu-Hor, or the companions or followers of Horus. So Schwaller is writing a long chapter with this in mind, going into the texts of Greco-Roman antiquity, talking about, citing many, many references of the Greek and the Roman writers who were taking an interest in Egypt, were all talking at one point or another about this Egyptian belief, Egyptian priesthood belief, that their civilization extended much, much further back. And so Schwaller puts together a long textual argument in which he's supporting the Egyptians' own notion that their civilization goes back much, much further. But it is a textual argument, and this is not science. There are better and worse, let's say, textual arguments. You can argue from now till doomsday about a passage in the Bible or a passage in Shakespeare, and there are better and worse arguments, let's say, but none of it is science, and it doesn't even pretend to be science. But at the end of this long chapter, Schwaller makes the observation Of course, the Great Sphinx has been weathered by water and not by wind and sand. And when I read that, I had a revelation of my own. Schwaller's revelation was at the Temple of Luxor. This was potentially science. This was geology. Either it was water-weathered or it wasn't water-weathered. And if it is water-weathered or was water-weathered, I'm not a geologist, but I knew a little bit about Egyptian geology and paleoclimatology. And I knew that the Sahara itself is a relatively new desert. It forms around 10,000 BC by, nobody knows exactly why or how, but it follows the breakup of the last ice age, which happens through some, again, mysterious cataclysmic event somewhere around 11,500 years ago, or 11,000 BC, thereabouts. Anyway, prior to that time, Sahara was not desert. It was relatively fertile savanna, something like modern-day Kenya. There were elephants and giraffes and ostriches. And then, more or less suddenly, it became desert. And with certain relatively rainy periods in between, let's say 10,000 BC and 3,500 BC, and then from about 3,500 BC on, it is desert as dry as it is today. I mean, it's dry. In Cairo these days, there's an average rainfall of about 1.5 inches, 2 inches per year. Now, I realized that if the Sphinx had been weathered by water, this was almost inconceivable that it could have happened in the time allowed for the, let's say, for the Sphinx's existence. Supposedly, the Sphinx is built by, or carved by, or under the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, the builder, supposed builder of the second pyramid, and that's 2,500 BC. By this time, Egypt is bone dry, and if it is weathered by water, where did the water come from? So I realized that if it were demonstrable, if it could be proved geologically that the Sphinx was actually weathered by water, this would almost certainly redate the Sphinx radically, drastically. It would put it back into a time somewhere, 10,000 BC or still earlier, at a time when there's not supposed to have been any civilization to speak of at all. We're all supposed to be just about recently come down out of the trees. We're hunter-gatherers, the human race I'm talking about, of course, etc., etc. So I understood that this was an observation of very considerable consequence, and even Schwaller seems not to have recognized what he came out with himself. In other words, that the argument about an older Egypt was fine as far as it went, but it could never be established scientifically through any kind of textual argument. But the geology, the water weathering of the Sphinx, that should be provable or disprovable, as the case may be. So I more or less downed tools on the work on the book itself, on the serpent. I was pretty much finished with it, mostly finished with it, and took a long side journey into geology. As I said, I am not a geologist, and some of the geology was fairly technical, but one thing was clear, and that was the establishment of this timeline, more or less. In other words, no desert prior to 10,000 BC, and from 10,000 BC on, it's desert, but with a few relatively extended rainy periods, but even then, not rain, not like rain in Wales or Assam in India or something like that. So anyway, I did my geological homework, and it all seemed plausible enough. But, of course, ideally, I had to get somebody to give me some sort of an idea. Schwaller, by this time, was long since dead. And I had to get somebody who knew what he was talking about to, at least for starters, say yes or no. So, as it happened, I was living in England at the time, and a friend of mine was teaching at Oxford, and he gave me an introduction to a well-known geologist there, and who agreed to see me, and I had a picture of the Sphinx, and I decided to play a little trick on him if he was agreeable, and that is that I had a picture of the side wall of the Sphinx without much of the repair work a part of it. If you see the Sphinx today, if you go to Egypt, you'll find that most of the body, the deeply weathered body, is covered with repair blocks, but at this time, back in the 70s, most of the still earlier repair blocks had fallen away, so you had a picture of this blank, deeply weathered wall, and of course the head of the Sphinx above it. So what I did was I masked off the head, so you couldn't see it was the Sphinx, and I masked off the back where you could see that it was the haunch of the lion's body, and all you saw was an expanse of deeply weathered stone. And I asked the geologist, who was a nice guy, if he minded if I played this little trick on him. You tell me, I have a simple question. Can you tell the difference between water weathering and wind and sand weathering? And he said, cautiously,
as a general rule, yes.
So I showed him the picture with the masking tape on, and he looked at this expansive weathered wall, and he said,
unquestionably, that is water weathering.
And I said, thank you very much. And I stripped off the masking tape from the head and from the haunch, and he had a very strange expression on his face, and he said,
oh.
And then he thought a minute and said,
you do understand, of course, that I'm not a desert specialist.
Now, actually, a little footnote here. Everybody laughs when I tell this at one of my lectures or even on site at the Sphinx itself. It sounds like a cop-out. Actually, it's not. If you have something, you feel that there's something wrong with your chest, and maybe your heart's doing funny things, and you have a friend who's a podiatrist, a foot doctor, and he's a doctor. But you say to him, I've got this weird pounding in my chest. Do you think there could be something wrong with my heart? And he says, well, yes, it could well be. But remember, I'm a podiatrist. I treat feet, not hearts. You should see a cardiologist. So fair enough. We'll use this image again in a little while in a different context. But so it wasn't really a cop-out. But for me, that was enough to go full steam ahead with my geological work. At the time, I guess I was living not in England, rather, but in Wales. Moved from England to Wales. And I got an interview with another geologist at, I think it was Cardiff or Swansea University. Did the same thing with him. And he was a little less positive than the other fellow. At Oxford, he said,
well, now, that is certainly consistent with what we know as water weathering.
Or words to that effect. So anyway, I had two geologists who were cautiously letting me know that in their opinion, this was water weathering. So that went into many, many weeks spent in the libraries. And in the last chapter of Serpent in the Sky, there was a long chapter on the whole idea of the Sphinx being water weathered. And at the time, there was plenty of geological evidence of tremendous floods in Egypt in the very, very distant past. In my own head, it was rather difficult to imagine how the Sphinx could have been weathered by floods, because it would have to be a flood of 66 feet of water. The body of the head goes 66 feet high, but the body is 45 or so feet high. So what kind of a flood could it be over a long period of time that would weather it that way? Anyway, I didn't know enough geology to make those kinds of distinctions. It looked like water weathering. There'd been water in Egypt. As far as I was concerned, it was water weathered. So out came the book in 78 or 79, first in England, then in America. And this long chapter on the geology of the Sphinx, the weathering of the Sphinx, drew precisely zero attention from academic quarters. Though it did, The Serpent in the Sky developed a following among alternative writers and alternative researchers as well, but no geologist coming forward to back me up. And so the geologists didn't come to me. I would go to the geologists. However, when I tried to write some of the people who were experts on desert geology, what I got back was a little bit of abuse and a lot of resounding silence. So there the matter rested until really about 10 years. And by this time I'd moved back to America, and I'd made a friend who was teaching English at Boston University, and he had been teaching English at the American University in Cairo, and there had become aware of my work of Serpent in the Sky, and we started a correspondence somewhere along the line and became good friends. And at one point we were having a dinner, and he said, I think this whole symbolist approach to Egypt is really important, and it really should be selling a lot more books, and a lot more attention should be paid to it. Is there anything that I can do from my position in academia to help you? And my response was instantaneous. Yes, please find me an open-minded geologist to look into the whole question of the weathering to the Sphinx. And I laughed when I said it because I knew from lots of experience already that finding an open-minded scientist in any discipline is about as easy as finding a fundamentalist Christian who loves his enemies.
PhoenixFire.
Anyhow, he said, wait a minute. Robert Eddy was his name. We've lost touch. But he said, there's a young geologist who works in my school at BU, and he might be interested in this. He said, but don't you say anything. He said, he wouldn't even tell me his name. He said, you're too incendiary and confrontational. Let me handle this. I said, okay. And I gave him a whole bunch of documentation. Off he went to BU. Didn't hear from him for months. I wrote him back, correspondence back and forth. Robert, what's going on? Well, he said he's very busy. He's this, he's that. He's read a bit of it. He's cautiously interested, but very skeptical. And then more time passed, letters back and forth. And then he said, well, he's really reading it through, but he really doesn't want to even get in touch with you until he's up for tenure, which was about to happen. And I laughed because I couldn't blame him. I knew that what we were talking about here is an overthrow of the entire history of civilization. Everything that we think about ancient history would be completely thrown into disarray if we were able to prove that the Sphinx was built 10,000 or more years ago. I mean, absolutely no question about this. I used cautiously, actually, in Serpent in the Sky, the word Atlantis, putting it carefully between inverted quotes so that I wasn't talking about a civilization that went down under the Atlantic Ocean or whatever, according to Plato's account. But nevertheless, this was inflammatory, and if Schock's colleagues knew that he was interested in establishing the existence of Atlantis, he wouldn't be getting his tenure. So I could appreciate that, even though I was champing at the bit myself. Anyhow, time passed, and eventually Schock was up for tenure. And once he was up for tenure, then he didn't mind. I don't exactly understand why that was good enough and not the tenure itself. But anyway, he was happy with that. And he got me invited to give a lecture to the faculty and interested students at Boston University. And I did that, brought my slides. And we were getting on very well. And Schock was cautiously positive about the whole thing. What he didn't understand, on the basis of my photographs, he didn't understand how nobody noticed this before, because it was so obvious to him as a geologist. Although, again, he was cautious. He said, well, until I go there, I really can't stick my neck out. I can't say anything. But he was interested, and he said, if you could get me over to Egypt, I would certainly be very happy to go there and take a look. And then we had a dinner and got talking on general things, friendly, and getting on very well. Schock himself is a big, tall, gangly guy. At that time, he was only 33 or 34 years old. He had 4 technical geological books out there. He was a recognized name in geology. He looked even younger than his 33 or 34 years, with long hippie hair. He was obviously not your average science professor in BU or any other university for that matter. He was obviously a very individualist-looking fellow. And at one point, we got talking about evolution, which, as you will see a few programs from now, is a favorite subject of mine. And the well-known, he's a geologist actually, but a writer on evolution, now deceased, Stephen Jay Gould. And so I cautiously asked Schock, just to sound him out, well, what do you think of Stephen Jay Gould? And Schock's answer was instantaneous. He's a bozo. I knew I had a friend as soon as he said that. resume in 2 minutes. Surprise! Until we find sponsors for our dedicated ad space, it's still John Anthony West, here to tell you about my personally guided magical Egypt tours. There's a fascination about Egypt, a glamour, a romance. On my trips, people tell me they've been dreaming of traveling to Egypt since early childhood. There are other wonderful sacred places in the world, Gothic cathedrals, Mayan pyramids, Islamic mosques, Hindu and Buddhist temples. But there is nothing anywhere that matches the grandeur, power, and perfection of Egypt. Yet unless you see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you've not seen Egypt at all. For it is only the symbolist interpretation developed by the brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and alchemist R.A. Shvalad that makes sense of the Egyptian experience. Where establishment academics see only a bizarre, architecturally accomplished but still primitive civilization, Shvala saw and proved that it was based upon a profound and sophisticated sacred science, a science of cosmic principles. One wonders how people come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before, wrote Florence Nightingale back in 1850. The answer is, they don't. 2 weeks in Egypt and you will understand the difference, finally, between true civilization and progress. For detailed information, see my website, jawest.net. Click on Magical Egypt Tours. These are one-of-a-kind trips. There is nothing like them. We find ways to avoid crowds. We meditate in the Great Pyramid. We get into places other people don't get into. The food is great, so are the hotels. The price is remarkably competitive. Just remember, if you don't see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you don't see Egypt at all.
PhoenixFire.
Welcome back to PhoenixFire and the history of the mystery of the Sphinx. We last left you at Boston University, where Robert Schoch rather unkindly described Stephen Jay Gould, and I realized that I had a friend, and now it was up to me to put together the financing to get Schoch over to Egypt so he could see the weathering for himself. This was not easy to do in my constant state of impecuniousness. Where I was going to get the money to get myself over to Egypt was often enough of a problem. Getting Schoch over there as well, and perhaps somebody to video what we were doing, this was posing a problem. But it was around this time that I had a talk to do. I often give lectures, and I had a talk at the Open Center in New York City. And there, it was a terrible cold day. I remember it very clearly because it was the lowest recorded November 10th in the history of New York. It was 10 below zero, believe it or not. And there was a packed house of people waiting to hear me talk about symbolist Egypt and the Sphinx, of course, the Sphinx theory. I was schmoozing with a few people who had been on my trips before and a few other friends. And all of a sudden, through this crowd of people, this big, burly fellow came, bearded, balding, bit overweight, barreling through the crowd very rudely, waving my guidebook in his hand, pushed everybody away and said, "I've traveled all over the world and I hate guidebooks, but somebody gave me this guidebook of yours and I had to go to Egypt and I really enjoyed using it. And here I found out, I just heard that you were giving a lecture here, so here I am, and would you sign my guidebook?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll sign your guidebook. What's your name?" And he said, "Boris Said, S-A-I-D. And I looked at him and I laughed, and I said, "I know you." I said, you grew up around White Plains, right? In Purchase, New York." And he said, "Yeah, how'd you know that?" And he said, "You don't remember me?" I said, "You, John West, you used to give me rides in your XK120 Jag when we were both in high school. You remember that?" And he looked at me and said, "What, you're that John West?" This was 40 years ago, and we were both 17. And I, like everybody else, this is just after World War II. My dream was somewhere along the line to get a second-hand Chevy convertible. Boris lived in rather palatial surroundings about 10 miles away. He already had an XK120 Jaguar, and he was racing a 1500cc little Maserati racing car. He was a race driver already. We got friendly, and it was he who inspired in me a lifelong love of fast cars. And it wasn't too long after that when, instead of the Chevy convertible, with money I'd saved up driving an ice cream truck in the summers, I bought a little yellow MGTD, 1953. Wish I had it now. And after that, while in the Army, my one and only white Porsche, and that was the last Porsche. If I'd stayed in advertising, I'd have more Porsches, but I also have more problems. Anyway, so I said, Boris, I know you. And he remembered me, and I said, yeah, I used to see that you used to be a race driver, and you were driving for Ferrari, and what happened? And anyway, that's for a longer autobiographical program in its own right. But I said to him, well, what are you doing now? I haven't seen you in the papers for quite a while. And he said, I'm making documentary films. And remember, I was just trying to get the financing together to get Shock over to Egypt. And I said, well, we better meet after this talk and discuss things. And so we did. Boris was producing documentary films, said he'd love to be involved in one way or another with the whole Sphinx project. He was working on some sort of a deal where he was selling a house-building machine to the Russians. His mother was Russian, his father was Persian, and his father apparently had been involved in the whole opening up of the Middle East oil fields and all sorts of stuff going on. Anyway, we reestablished this relationship, and meanwhile, I was scraping together a little bit of money from friends and relatives and anybody who contributed $1,000 or $2,000 into the pot to get Shock over to Egypt with me. So eventually, sure enough, put together enough money, and Boris is signed on as producer, and we get enough money so that we can go over with at least one videographer, another good friend of mine, who's a professional camera lady. And so we brought her, and I forget exactly who else, but a couple more people. We had a little entourage going over there, but no permissions to do anything officially. But there was no point in trying to get the permissions, which I knew would not be easy anyway. Heretics do not get permissions easily. But anyway, just as tourists, I figured that should be enough for Shock to be able to say, if not definitively, at least conditionally, yes or no. So over we went to Egypt, and it was one of those periods where they just had some sort of an incident there, and everybody was terrified, so we had Egypt more or less to ourselves. The Americans all disappear at the first sign of any danger. In case you haven't noticed, America is neither the land of the free, nor is it the home of the brave. Anytime there is any kind of an event anywhere, the Americans are the first to run away. So be it. Over to Egypt we went. This was very intriguing, but actually often infuriating week that we spent there, a week or 10 days with Shock, because we went over the Giza Plateau, and of course I knew the plateau like the palm of my hand by this time because I'd been there a number of times working out the Sphinx theory, and Shock would walk and slowly look at every little rock, and I mean, we couldn't get into the Sphinx enclosure, so he couldn't actually rub his hands on the Sphinx itself or get his nose up to it, but he was very carefully considering it. The problem was when we had the camera turned on to get him to utter a declarative sentence where he said, yes, this sure looks to me like water weathering. But it was pretty clear that he was pretty well convinced, but he was not about to declare himself until it could be official, until we actually had permission to get into that enclosure and get our work done.
PhoenixFire.
So everything had to go on hold, but it became clear now at this point that we had a double problem. We had to get the permissions to do this officially, and ideally, Shock would wanted to be able to work with the geophysicist who could bring over some kind of ground-penetrating equipment, radar or seismographs or both, something of that sort, so that we could look around to see if there was anything underground that would, let's say, back up this whole notion of a much, much older Sphinx and a stage of civilization preceding dynastic Egypt by many thousands of years. So, whereas our first expedition, we managed to bring that in for about $12,000, we were now looking at something well over $100,000. And this is where Boris came into play. And now I was realizing that I had kind of a tiger by the tail with Boris, because he was a very, very difficult character, absolutely with an explosive temper, endless energy and charisma, and not a terribly high regard for honesty. I often caught him on the phone telling people all sorts of outrageous things. But without him, nothing was going to happen, because what looked like on the surface, actually, the perfect marriage of the man of action and the man of thought. Because I think to make things happen is very difficult for me. Boris didn't think an awful lot. Plenty intelligent, but let's say philosophy wasn't his strong point. But he could do. He was a man of unbelievable energy. And so he went out to put together the money to make this thing work. So eventually, we got the money together by hook or by crook. Afterwards, I learned with Boris, a lot of it was by crook. More on this as we get into it. We had, through my friend who does my trips in Egypt, we had an entry to getting those permissions, because my friend who ran my trips worked for a firm with a man with a very bad reputation over in Egypt. But he was a major player. He not only ran the travel agency, but he also was a major Egyptian filmmaker, and he was a very good friend of the then Minister of Culture, and he assured us that he would be able to get the permission for us, official. And without going into a long story about how he got this permission, he did get it, as long as there was something in it for him. Eventually, there wasn't anything in it for him, but that's still another story. But we had our permission. We finally got our money together. Meanwhile, I'm actually a little bit unclear. I have to go back into my own notes to see which came first. But at some point, we're now at about the time of the first Gulf War, and Egypt was closed down. There was you couldn't get over there, either as a tourist or for scientific investigation. We had the money, and we had our geophysicist, Tom DeBecke, who had rented, or would rent when the time came, seismographs to go looking around for what we hoped would be something underground that looked interesting, that backed up the whole theory of the lost civilization. And so we had to wait for the war to finish, and then we went with an entourage, very interesting entourage, of about 15 or 16 people who were our investors, the people who put up the money for this thing. So this was probably no other scientific expedition in history ever looked quite like this one, because there were astrologers, and there were magicians, and there were healers, and there were hard-nosed scientists, and there were very reputable and wealthy business people, and it was a mixed bag of people all coming to watch us, we hoped, change history around. And we had our piece of paper that said we had permission to get in there and do this work. Well, the trouble started. It started at the airport itself, getting the seismograph in. This took more finagling, and calling up my friend Mohammed, who got his boss, who was, as I said, an absolutely unscrupulous, really crooked businessman, but with deep connections and willing to help. So eventually we got our seismographs in, and we had our piece of paper signed by the minister, the head of Egyptian antiquities, and then all of a sudden we're ready to get to work, and who should come into the picture but Zahi Hawass. At that time, he was director of the Giza Plateau. He was not, as he is today, the top honcho. Now it's a ministerial position, and Zahi is director of antiquities, and he was not my friend at that time. Amazingly enough, more about this later on, he now is, even though from a scholarly point of view he's as much opposed to the ideas as ever. We have, through a strange set of bizarre circumstances, I sometimes think there is an angel sitting up there somewhere along the line making these strange things happen. We have buried the hatchet and are actually on very good personal terms. We go out and have a drink together and smoke the shisha. But anyway, at this time, he was not a friend. And he came in and he said, I did not sign that piece of paper, and I am the head of the Giza Plateau. And all of a sudden, there we were with expensive seismographs and expensive geophysicists and all of our people sitting around on their hands, waiting for something to happen. And it's the middle of Ramadan, so nothing happens in Egypt. And here we are desperately trying to get permission to go and do our work. So eventually, again, bringing, as he was called, the head of the tourist agency that my friend Mohammed worked for, the shark, we called him. The shark got to work and somehow or another made this permission work, except, and now we had a real film crew with us, but except now we were not allowed to film. We were allowed to do our work, but not do any filming. Well, the filming was crucial to the whole business, actually, because we knew that we could not expect any help from normal academic sources, none whatsoever. All we were going to get from academic sources is opposition. But we knew that if we were going to make this thing pay itself off and get money back to our sponsors, even if they only broke even, they'd be happy. We were going to have to get this thing on television somehow or another. No internet in those days. So it was crucial that we somehow got enough filming in so that we'd have something to show to get the budget together to do a real film on this thing, assuming that the evidence came up the way we wanted it to come up, and that Jacques didn't suddenly change his mind and say, whoops, it could be wind and sand weathering after all, and maybe it does date from 2500 BC. So the filming was a crucial part of this, and this is where Boris came into his own. He's now deceased, Boris, but I'm convinced that in 17 different former lifetimes he must have been a buccaneer, because as soon as it was illegal, he was absolutely at his best, an endless source of finding ways to get the filming done without somehow or another the word of it getting back to Zahi Hawass. So we managed to get in enough filming under very adverse circumstances, and our 2-week projected trip was now reduced to a week because we were sitting around for a week in the hotel waiting, trying to get our permission to do our work. But anyway, long and short of all of this was that we did get the work done, or we got a lot of the work done. Jacques was now absolutely convinced that it was water weathering, and the one mistake I had made, and I must say I'm not proud of myself in retrospect, but the only mistake I made in Serpent in the Sky, a major mistake, was that I attributed this water weathering to floodwaters, even though I personally had reservations. I didn't see how it could be floodwaters, but water weathering it was, and it wasn't floodwaters. The only thing that would explain the pattern of weathering that we see, actually, if you go to my website, you'll probably find a lot of argument there and a lot of photographic backup for the way the Sphinx looks. It's worth doing because as long as this program is and as detailed as it is, it's one of those times when a picture really is worth 1,000 words. Doesn't matter whose words, mine or anyone else's. When you see the Sphinx, when you see the photographic documentation, and even more so when you're over there in Egypt in the Sphinx enclosure and you look at it and you listen to the theory, you say, my God, I mean, how can anybody have missed that? And this, of course, was the reaction of Jacques himself and of Tom DeBecke, the geophysicist. It was just inconceivable that geologists had been walking all over that plateau for 150 years, and it hadn't occurred to anybody up to Schwaller's time to say, gee, this looks like water weathering. Well, it's not so obvious in the sense that you're in the middle of the desert, so you don't even think about water weathering, but the pattern that you see on the walls of the Sphinx, and especially on the enclosure wall, more about that later on, is so clear that it should have rung a bell in some geologist's mind, but anyway, it didn't, and there we were ringing our loud bell. So it was then clear, and it wasn't even Jacques who noticed this, it was one of the people on our group who was a marine biologist with a geology background, that what was responsible for this weathering, what could only be responsible for it, was rainfall, precipitation, lots and lots of precipitation over long, long periods of time. How long the periods of time, what quantities of precipitation have yet to be determined, but water weathering it was. Jacques was now 100% agreed and willing to stick his tenured neck out. We actually found what appears to be a cavity or a chamber or a void under the left paw of the Sphinx, where the famous American psychic Edgar Cayce had predicted there would be what he called the Hall of Records with the history of Atlantis beneath it, and the seismograph did show a cavern, big cavern, 12 by 15 meters under about 5 meters of bedrock, and more on this when we return. And now, since heretics also have to eat, here come the ads. Magical Egypt, a symbolist tour in DVD, and more besides. If you can't take a trip to Egypt and experience it firsthand, well, you can't. Not everyone can, but next best, and the closest you can get to experiencing Egypt, is our 8-episode documentary series, Magical Egypt, a symbolist tour. This is the brainchild of my partner, Chance Gardner, a graphic designer and 3D animator of genius, and this series is an absolutely unique visual, emotional, and intellectual media experience. There are innumerable documentaries about Egypt, dry as dust, misleading, repetitive exercises in Egyptological establishmentarianism, from the National Geographic or Discovery Channel, or some other wielder of the academic cookie cutter. Pretty pictures, nothing ever that feeds the mind, the heart, to say nothing of the soul. This series fills that gap. We explore Egypt in depth. We followed the ramifications into alchemy, the tarot deck, modern DNA research, sacred geometry, the mysteries of ancient technology. There are interviews with leading-edge scholars, scientists, and thinkers, each contributing to a radical revision of our understanding of the past. For more information, go to www.magicalegypt.com, and more. If you've not read My Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, maybe it's time you did. An in-depth introduction to Shwala Delubich's symbolist interpretation. Our Emmy Award-winning classic documentary, Mystery of the Sphinx, now available in an upgraded DVD version. My guidebook, A Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, an invaluable source of information for armchair and actual travelers to Egypt. I have a few copies of my out-of-print first non-fiction book, The Case for Astrology, left for sale. See my website, www.jawest.net. Click on Books.
PhoenixFire.
Welcome back to PhoenixFire. We last left our hero, who happens to be me, with his friend Robert Schoch, the geologist, on the Giza Plateau, having established to Schoch's satisfaction that the Sphinx was indeed weathered by water, specifically rainwater, precipitation falling in the very distant past over long periods of time, meaning as a consequence that our entire view of ancient history and of the evolution of human civilization was in drastic need of a severe and radical shake-up. And while we were at it, we also think we might have discovered the cavern under the left paw of the Sphinx, which, according to Edgar Cayce, should contain the records of Atlantis. But we knew enough not to mention the A word in polite company. We stuck with the water weathering, and now the next objective was to get this finding, to get this work of ours out there before the public. And since we could not expect very kind treatment from either the mainstream press or the mainstream media, the trick was to get it out there in the public somehow or another in some sort of a venue that nevertheless carried academic or scientific respectability with it. So the decision was to see if we could get a presentation at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. The next one coming up was 1991. So this was Schoch's department, and he came over to my house in the Catskills from Boston, and we spent the afternoon. The whole idea was to write a scholarly abstract to get permission to be there. Now, I should say, for those of you who haven't been to a GSA meeting, and probably most of you have not unless you're a geologist, this is kind of the Super Bowl of geology. Everybody who is anybody who has any kind of new material to, or new discoveries or new work to demonstrate and show his colleagues. It's a trade show, but open to the public, of course. But this is where you go if you've discovered something that you think is of real interest to the geological community, and by extension to the public at large. It's a big thing. It's a huge convention hall with maybe a couple of hundred booths for poster presentations, and for a few auditoriums where there's a sort of 3 or 4 ring circus going on simultaneously of presentations, of oral presentations of new work. It's peer-reviewed, which automatically doesn't mean that what you've discovered is of tremendous significance, but it does mean that it's professionally peer-reviewed, and if it sounds outrageous or you haven't done your homework, you're not going to get a venue. So it's not as though it's exclusive, and it's not a guarantee that what you're talking about is correct, but it means that it adheres to certain agreed-upon professional standards. So Shock came over to my place, and the whole idea was to craft an abstract, which is a page, basically, explaining what it was that we were doing. And we spent the whole afternoon actually, again, at Shock's insistence, trying to make this abstract as unrevolutionary and as boring as humanly possible, so that the A word would not appear. Nobody would dream that we perhaps found a suspicious cavern or chamber underneath the left paw of the Sphinx. This was strictly written in impeccable geologies, not intended to inflame or barely interest anybody, but just a geological inquiry into water weathering of Great Sphinx. It's not a big deal. It just slightly changes the opinion on sand weathering, and well, no, it's really weathered by water, and we don't mention that this is maybe 12,000 BC. It's a really dull abstract. So, of course, it was accepted. It was sufficiently dull and non-committal. And all of a sudden, there we were going to the GSA meeting in San Diego in 1991. Now, a couple of things come into play here, because almost synchronously with the GSA meeting, it just so happened that I had a lecture to do, or a presentation at a real new agey body, mind, and spirit conference in San Jose. So we're going to combine these things in one, and Boris was out there with us, having been instrumental in all of these various capacities. And there we were at the Body, Mind, and Spirit conference, me talking about our new work on the geology of the Sphinx and Symbolist Egypt. And at this conference, we met up with Richard Hoagland, who was the science writer and science correspondent who was most responsible for bringing to the public the whole idea of the face on Mars and the possibility of a civilization on Mars. And I felt at that time, and in fact still do, that Hoagland takes, if possible, more flack for his work than we take for ours. But I still think, and so do a number of other people with credentials and necks on the line, I can believe anything I want. I have nothing to lose in the sense of losing credibility with my academic peers, because I don't have any academic peers and I don't care. So I can be as outrageous as I want. In fact, I'm not. I'm very careful about what I call evidence and what I don't call evidence, but I don't have anything to lose. Some of the people who still support Hoagland's Mars work have a lot to lose, and they still support it. And that's another story altogether. Maybe one of these days we'll have Dick Hoagland on this show. This was the first meeting in up there in San Jose. And so Hoagland was very interested in our work. And incidentally, I've been in touch with Hoagland over these many years. And for some strange reason, he always brings me luck. And you'll see why in a second. Other people have problems with Hoagland, but sometimes. And he's a pretty, he can be quite contentious in his own way. But we get on, and he brings me luck. And here's the first instance of Hoagland bringing us luck. We were at this San Jose conference, and we got talking. I forget if it was over a couple of drinks or over dinner. And he said, well, if we were on our way to San Diego, we should stop in Hollywood and visit a friend of his, a Hollywood producer named Robert Watts, who was interested in Hoagland's work and would probably be interested in ours. So we said, all right. The name meant nothing to us. And Hoagland gave us an address at the Universal Studios. So Boris and I were going to go visit Robert Watts. We knew nothing of who he was. Boris was supposed to be a film producer. He was a film producer. He'd done one film about dolphins that never got anywhere. It's sort of an interesting film. Boris will come up again big time as this story goes on. But so off we go. So he didn't know any more about Robert Watts than I did. Name meant nothing to me. And Universal Studios, we called them up, nice English voice on the phone, and get invited to the studios. And Amblin Studios at Universal City or whatever it's called. So we go in our little rented car, and we're driving through this wilderness of Universal Studios. And the name Amblin rings a bell, but I don't remember where it rings a bell from, or Boris doesn't know either. So we're driving around. We stopped at a bunch of techie guys sitting on drinking beer outside, beautiful weather. And we say, "Where's Amblin Studios?" And so they direct us to Amblin Studios, and as we part, one of the guys waves a beer bottle at us and says, "Say hi to Stephen for me while you're at it." Stephen? Who? Stephen who? Can only be one Stephen we can think of that we're supposed to say hello to. And sure enough, we end up at Amblin, which is this big, quite beautiful faux adobe. Maybe it's real adobe, but it doesn't look real. It looks like a stage set. Low building, very tastefully done. And we walk in, and Amblin Studios is, of course, Steven Spielberg's division or whatever it is in Hollywood. So we walk in, and there's a secretary, and there's a desk, and it's all doesn't look the way you expect a Hollywood studio to look. At my first Hollywood studio, it's very tasteful, and there are pillars, no big glaring posters anywhere. There's a few lit pillars, and we're looking at these pillars, and it says Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it has various hits of Spielberg hits, and they're featured pretty prominently on certain of these lit things as Robert Watts, associate producer. Us and Boris and I are looking at each other. Well. Now we know who Robert Watts is. So eventually we wait around for a little while, and we get invited into a private room, and this is a quite fantastic room with a walnut refectory table with a single slab about 8 inches thick. And in comes Robert Watson. He's a very casual-looking, Hollywoody sort of guy with the jeans and a chambray shirt that probably cost as much as my car, but it looked just like a chambray shirt. And red hair and casual manner. "Hi, guys. Nice of Stephen to let us use his private dining room, wasn't it?" "Ah, so, Stephen, yes, of course, Stephen's private dining room." So we sit down and we outline the Sphinx theory to him. We're on our way to San Diego. He's the sweetest guy in the world. He loves the work, and he's very interested in the project, and what can he do to help? Exactly what we wanted to hear. So we will keep him in the loop and let him know what happens. We're off to San Diego to present all of this material to a few thousand geologists who, according to Shock, are by no means polite if they think the quality of the work is baloney. So anyway, we've made a good friend with Robert Watts, who wants to help, and off we go to San Diego. So we get there, and we have our presentation. We have our little booth, one of hundreds of booths, and we're well prepared. We've got beautiful big photographs taken by Caroline Davies, who was our stills photographer when we were doing our science, and she stayed on to go all over Egypt doing all kinds of wonderful photography. You might look on my website, jawest.net, in the photo gallery. There are lots of Caroline's photos there. So we have that, and we've got a video, a VCR loop that runs through the evidence with, I forget if it's Shock or myself, I guess Shock, but it was explaining what's going on the video loop. And we set up our presentation, and then all of a sudden we're called, and the GSA, the Geological Society of America, is holding a press conference, and we are one of 3 or 4 exhibitions or exhibits or presentations that they want to meet the press. And fact is, when you think about it, boring as we tried to be, it was impossible to conceal the revolutionary significance of a water-weathered sphinx. And scientists are always, every scientific discipline is desperate to show a human face to the rest of the world, because in a lot of instances the face is either inhuman or subhuman or not human at all. Scientists used to be gods before World War I and before World War II, but their godlike structure has been considerably tarnished since World War II with some of the horrific things that science and its goon squad technology has come up with. So every scientific discipline looks very hard for something that will interface between the general unscientific public and themselves. So we were one of the exhibits. We were going to meet the press, and we were not prepared for this. This was early in the morning, and all of a sudden there we are, and there's a gang of press there, scientific press, mainstream press, Los Angeles Times, New York Times. So we do our little presentation. I forget, actually, it was Shock or myself who did it. I think both of us. And anyway, everybody's very interested in it. There's a very positive reaction from the press. And off we go to do our presentation. And it's, of course, it's a poster presentation means that you're sitting there ready to, whoever comes along to ask questions, to look at the evidence. And this turned out to be actually the best possible venue. An oral presentation would not have been as good because people can't ask questions. You have 20 minutes, go explain the universe in 20 minutes. And the Sphinx, the weathering to the Sphinx, complicated question. So, but with all the evidence there, so dozens and dozens and dozens of people come by the booth. Shock is in attendance. The feedback loop the video loop is playing. And this is a big success. I mean, people are coming up to us. In one instance, Shock, who's really edgy about this because he's in front of his colleagues, and if somebody comes along and says, and right up to the end, Shock has always wondered, my God, can it be as simple as this? What if I'm wrong? Somebody comes along and says, no, you jerk, it's not that at all. It's something else, and this is what it is. But that didn't happen. At one point, someone came along, Shock talking to him, and he started laughing, and Shock was very nervous. All of a sudden, he said, well, you know, what's wrong? And the guy said, well, how can anybody miss this? It's so obvious. So it was Shock's own reaction, and here we had it from other geologists who did not have a stake in the matter. I mean, in fact, of the probably hundreds of geologists that came by that booth, that presentation, not one had an adverse reaction. And as Shock said, if they had an adverse reaction, they would have let us know. If they saw something wrong with the evidence, we'd have known pretty smartly that there was, and not a one. And in fact, dozens of guys gave us their names and wanted to know if they could be of any help in carrying on future work. And Shock somewhere wrote all these down on a big legal yellow pad, and they're sitting there still because the hope was that we would get permission to get back in there and do still further work. But that's a part of the story that's coming up, not maybe this second. So the press conference is over, the presentation is a big success, and then all of a sudden, by the next day, this thing has blown up into a firestorm. There are major articles in scientific journals, particularly the science sections of the mainstream press, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, I think Chicago Tribune. But all of a sudden, this is big news. We are all over the world. We're on a bit of television, I forget who it was or whatever, but this thing is everywhere, and no sooner is it up there than the reaction comes in from the academics, from the Egyptologists and the archaeologists, and they are in an uproar. They are furious. We are getting insulted by all sorts of, how can this be? Hundreds of geologists have combed the Giza Plateau for thousands of years, or maybe it's the other way around, thousands of geologists for hundreds of years. This is outrageous. There are, said one eminent Egyptologist, curator of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts at the time, there are no major surprises in store. Wonderful line. I will use that in a book someday. Son of Mystery of the Sphinx, Part 2, coming up next show. Thank you.
PhoenixFire. Show notes available at www.PhoenixFire.blogspot.com. Music and production by Geraint Hughes. www.thepodule.com. More information on John Anthony West is available at www.jawest.net.